Liam Davenport had not come to the Harmon Prestige auction house to make an impression. He arrived with a car beneath an old canvas tarp, a 7-year-old girl holding his hand, and a thin folder tucked under one arm. The room went quiet when the tarp came down, and then the laughter started. Giselle Harmon, CEO of Harmon Prestige, studied the rusted frame from one end to the other and set it in front of every client present. Why would anyone bring scrap metal here? Liam did not answer. He placed the folder down on the table and simply waited. Liam's answer never came from his own mouth. It came from the man who had just walked through the door. The morning had come in low and gray over New Haven, the kind of late October light that turned everything the color of old photographs. Inside the garage behind the house on Prospect Hill Road, the overhead bulb buzzed and threw its pale circle across the concrete floor. A camping pot gurgled on a hot plate in the corner. The smell of coffee and cold metal and motor oil had settled into every surface of that room, the way smells do when they have nowhere else to go, absorbed into the walls and the workbench and the seams of old wood, until the smell became indistinguishable from the space itself. Carenza Davenport sat on the old wooden stool by the workbench, feet not quite reaching the floor. She was 7 years old, small for her age, and she held the little red Ferrari in both hands, the way other children held stuffed animals not to play with, but because letting go required a decision she hadn't yet made. The model was no larger than a bar of soap. The paint had worn smooth at the nose where fingers had rubbed it over years, first her mother's and then her own. It had belonged to Clara. Now it belonged to no one, and to Carenza in equal measure, and the distinction had never once been raised. Liam stood at the far end of the garage, 38 years old, broad across the shoulders, wearing a flannel shirt the blue of faded denim that he had never gotten around to replacing. His hands were the kind of hands that answered questions before he opened his mouth, calloused at the base of the fingers, stained at the knuckle lines with grease that soap could not fully reach, the hands of a man who had spent 15 years in small garages doing precise work with imprecise tools and had made his peace with the trade-off. He stood with both palms flat on the workbench and looked at the far wall the way a man looks when he has already made a decision and is only waiting for his mind to catch up to it. He turned and walked to the back of the garage. An old canvas tarp covered the rear bay, draped from floor to nearly ceiling, bunched and tied at the corners with fraying rope. Liam pulled one knot loose and let the tarp fall to the concrete. The car underneath was not beautiful, not at first, not to anyone who didn't know where to look. The body panels showed rust along every lower seam, the kind that comes from decades in a garage with imperfect drainage and from humidity, and time doing what humidity and time always do when left alone with metal. The original red paint had faded to a dull brown pink in the places where it hadn't lifted entirely, and in those places the primer beneath showed through in gray patches. The windshield frame was intact. The body lines, underneath all of it, were still there, low and long and shaped with the particular deliberateness of something designed to cut through air at speed, not to stand in a garage for 50 years and collect the slow attention of rust. Liam stood beside it for a moment, without touching it. He had done this many times over the years, stood and looked. The way you look at something that belongs to a story larger than yourself, something you have been trusted with rather than given. He picked up the manila folder from the workbench and tucked it under one arm. "Are we going today, Dad?" Carenza said from her stool. "We're going," he said. She looked at the car, the way she always looked at it, curious and careful, as if it might say something if she waited long enough. "Are you sure?" He walked to her, crouched to her level, and tucked a loose piece of hair behind her ear. Raymond said cars are built to run, not to stand in the dark forever. She nodded, as if this settled something she had already half decided. Liam backed the flatbed trailer to the garage door, and together the man and the girl, in the gray October morning, they loaded the car. He had been carrying the reason for this trip quietly for weeks, telling Carenza only what she needed to know, not because he thought she couldn't hold the weight of it, but because some things are better given in parts. Carenza's spine required surgery, a procedure her orthopedic surgeon in Hartford had described as corrective and necessary, and that the insurance carrier had described, in different language, as partially covered. The gap between those two descriptions was significant enough that Liam had spent the better part of 6 months closing it by other means. The savings account, the refinanced mortgage, the truck that hadn't had new tires in 2 years. What remained was the car. What remained had always been the car he had known that, if he was honest, from the beginning. He had simply been waiting for the moment when knowing it and acting on it felt like the same thing. The building that housed Harmon Prestige Auctions occupied a corner lot in the 9th Square district of downtown New Haven, all glass and brushed steel, and a brass nameplate beside the entrance that had been polished so many times it had begun to wear thin at the edges. A doorman in a wool coat stood at the top of 3 marble steps. The display windows facing the street held a Ferrari 275 GTB in Bordeaux red and a Jaguar E-Type under dark cloth, positioned the way a museum positions things it wants you to look at and not approach. The air inside smelled of climate control and leather conditioner, and the particular stillness of rooms where significant transactions had been conducted for a long time. Liam's truck and trailer pulled into the delivery bay on the building's north side. A young parking attendant leaned out of his booth, looked at the truck, looked at the tarp-covered shape on the trailer, and issued a numbered ticket without comment. His face communicated, without language, that this was not the category of arrival the bay was typically designed to accommodate. Liam helped Carenza down from the passenger seat. She landed on the pavement holding the little red model against her chest and reached up for his hand without being asked. They walked through the side entrance, past the delivery check-in, and into the building's main reception hall. The hall was high-ceilinged and quiet in the way of spaces that take their silence seriously. A handful of men in dark suits stood near a long table to one side, talking in the low register of people conducting business they find routine. A woman in heels crossed the marble floor from one hallway to another without glancing up. At the far end, an Aston Martin DB5 sat on a raised platform under 3 spotlights that had been positioned to make it look like it was already in a museum, which it very nearly was. The woman at the reception desk, her placard, read Hannah Cross. Client Services looked up from her keyboard, looked at Liam, looked at Carenza, then looked back at her screen long enough to confirm the appointment. Liam Davenport, 10 o'clock, submission intake. She directed them to the assessment wing on the lower level. A man named Aaron Cole appeared from a side corridor, early 30s, navy suit, small enamel pin on the lapel, and offered to show them back. He held doors, said the right things, and kept his face in the expression of someone performing courtesy for someone he had already made a quiet judgment about. The assessment room was large and white-lit, the kind of light that showed everything. 3 other vehicles were already positioned. A Porsche 356, being documented by a technician with a camera, an old racing prototype on jack stands with a man working underneath, and an Alfa Romeo coupe in navy that someone had draped in a padded transport blanket. The room smelled of rubber and light oil and the faint metallic edge of professional attention, the smell of rooms where things were looked at closely, where surfaces mattered. Liam walked the trailer in through the wide bay door, cut the straps, walked to the front of the covered car, and pulled the tarp down in a single motion. 2 of the technicians looked up. A third set his camera down. The way they stopped looking, the way they turned their attention deliberately back to their own work, as if they had collectively decided not to register what they had seen, said more than any comment would have. Aaron Cole stood at the edge of the room with his clipboard, and an expression that had shifted from courtesy to something closer to careful neutrality. Then the door from the upper hallway opened, and Giselle Harmon walked in. She was 44 years old, and she moved through rooms the way certain people do when they have spent long enough in authority that announcing their presence has become unnecessary. The room simply adjusts, the way a room adjusts to a change in temperature. The gray suit was impeccably cut, the kind of tailoring that cost enough to make the cost invisible. Her dark hair was pulled back smooth and low at the nape of her neck. She did not look around when she entered. She looked at what she looked at, and everything eagles in her field of vision won begasse at her. Her eyes found the car. She stood still for a moment. Then she looked at Liam, the full-length look, unhurried, from the worn flannel collar to the scuffed work boots, the kind of look that is not really about seeing but about placing, about deciding in advance where something belongs. She walked toward the car slowly, arms crossed, and stood at its nose studying the rust and the peeling paint and the dull chrome with the expression of someone who has seen a great many things and learned to immediately recognize the ones not worth her time. She walked the full length of it, heel to toe on the concrete, and when she reached the tail, she turned back to face the room. There were perhaps 7 people present. She did not lower her voice. "This is a Harmon Prestige facility," she said. "Not a salvage lot." Liam said, "I know. I had an appointment." Giselle raised one eyebrow, the slow, deliberate kind. Not quite surprise, but its close relative, the one that has decided to find something faintly worth noting. "An appointment," she said. Then she looked at the car again, then at Liam, and then she looked at the room at all of them, as if drawing them in as an audience, and her voice carried cleanly to every corner. "In 15 years at this company, I have seen some ambitious submissions come through that bay door, but I believe this is the first time anyone has brought in something unidentifiable, unplated, and structurally compromised, and presented it as an auction candidate." A technician across the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to serve the same function. Aaron Cole turned slightly toward the wall. One of the clients who had stepped into the doorway from the hall exchanged a glance with the man beside him. The quiet that followed was the kind with texture, the kind that has been shaped by something said into it. Carenza's hands tightened on the little red model. Her eyes had gone red at the rims, but she did not look away from her father, and she did not cry. She was 7 years old, and she had learned, in the 3 years since her mother died, that the most important thing in a room was often her father's face, and what it told her about whether to be afraid. Liam put one hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just there, the way you place a hand on something you want to remain steady. He looked at Giselle. His face had not changed. Then Giselle looked at Carenza for the first time, a long second, the kind that registers the child as something beyond furniture, and when she looked back at Liam, her voice had dropped, quieter now but no less precise. "Did you bring her for sympathy?" The room registered this differently than the last remark. Something in the ambient noise shifted slightly downward. Liam waited one beat. "You haven't asked what it is," he said. "Giselle, I don't need to ask what a pile of rust is." He did not answer. He bent, opened the folder, and laid its contents on the assessment table one sheet at a time, arranged left to right with the unhurried attention of someone who has planned this moment. He pulled a chair out for Carenza. She sat. Then he stood beside the table and said nothing else. Giselle looked at the papers for a moment without moving toward them. Then she looked at Aaron. "Show him the rejection procedure and help him find the exit." Aaron began to cross the room. The door at the far end opened. The man who entered was tall, somewhere past 60, with hair that had gone entirely white in the way that sometimes happens well ahead of schedule and stays that way as if it had decided the matter. He wore a tweed jacket the color of dark tobacco, worn at the cuffs and elbows in a way that had nothing to do with fashion. He carried a leather satchel so old the corners had gone smooth, and he walked with the unhurriedness of someone who has long since concluded that arriving faster does not meaningfully improve anything. Sebastian Crane had been called in to examine a Jaguar E-Type in the third bay, a routine authentication, arranged 2 weeks prior, the kind of work he had performed perhaps 30 times a year for more than 3 decades, for Christie's, for R.M. Sotheby's, for Bonham's, for private collectors who needed to know the truth about something before they spent a significant portion of their fortune on it. He had written the definitive reference text on Ferrari racing cars of the 1960s. He taught 1 semester per year at the Concorso d'Eleganza Foundation Seminar in Lake Como and received fewer phone calls than anyone in his field warranted because he answered them on his own schedule and had made his peace with the consequences of that policy. He came through the door and swept the room with the habitual, half-conscious inventory of a man who had spent decades in spaces like this, and began walking toward the third bay. He stopped, not gradually, not as if something had caught his eye from a distance, and he was deciding whether to investigate. He stopped the way a person stops when the body understands something before the mind has finished its argument. His left foot was still mid-stride when the motion ceased entirely. He stood there with one hand extended, and his satchel half-swung, staring at the car in the center of the room with the fixed and absolute attention of a man who has just heard his own name, called in a language he thought no one else spoke. The magnifying glass he kept in the outside chest pocket fell through the flap without him noticing. It hit the concrete and spun once and lay still. "Stop," He set it at normal volume, without raising it, without explaining. The word passed through the ambient noise of the room and settled everything into stillness, the way a hand laid on a vibrating string silences it. Aaron Cole was mid-step. He stood where he was. Giselle turned from across the room. "Sebastian, you're late," I said. "Stop." He set his satchel on the floor where he stood, retrieved a small flashlight from his inner jacket pocket, and walked directly to the car's left side, without looking at anyone. He crouched, angled the light low beneath the body line where the rocker panel met the floor rail, into the shadow below the chassis member. He held the beam there. His lips moved slightly. His other hand reached up and touched the metal just fingertips, as gently as a man who has handled fragile things all his adult life and understands that the moment of contact is not the moment to become careless. Then he closed his eyes. He held them closed for a moment that stretched long enough that several people in the room exchanged a glance. When he opened them, his hand was still on the car. He rose slowly, keeping the flashlight on, and turned to look at Liam Davenport, not the appraising look that Giselle had given him, but something different, something that belonged to a different category of recognition entirely. The look of a man who has spent a significant portion of his working life searching for something, and is now standing 3 feet from it. "Who are you?" Sebastian said. Not a question in the usual sense, more like the opening line of something that needed to be established clearly before anything else could proceed. "Liam Davenport. This is my late wife's family's car. Her name, Clara. Her maiden name was Holt. Her great-grandfather was Raymond Holt." The room was quiet. Sebastian looked at Liam for several seconds. Then he exhaled slowly, deliberately, like a man releasing a breath he had been holding for longer than this morning, and turned to face Giselle Harmon. When he spoke, his voice was level and informational, the voice of a man describing what is simply true. "Giselle, this man has brought you one of 32 Ferrari 250 LMs ever produced, chassis number 19. The only car in the series with a documented Le Mans finish under private ownership, Raymond Holt, 1965. This car disappeared from all registration records after 1967. No recorded sale, no export, no dismantling." He paused. He looked at her directly, without accommodation. "I have been searching for it for 20 years. No one in the room moved for a moment. Then Sebastian retrieved his satchel from the floor, carried it to the assessment table, opened it, and produced a heavy, hardbound book. The spine read, "The Forgotten 250s. Ferrari's Racing Orphans," along with a laminated sleeve containing several documents that he laid with care beside the papers Liam had already placed on the table. He did this without performance, with the directness of a man who has decided to be useful and is proceeding accordingly. "The Ferrari 250 LM, he said, not for the room's benefit, but because this was information that needed to be heard accurately, and he was the person best qualified to provide it, had been produced in limited numbers between 1963 and 1965. 32 cars in total. Ferrari had designed it as a mid-engine racing sports car, drawing from the prototype architecture developed for Le Mans. Ferrari submitted it to the FIA for Grand Touring homologation, seeking a classification that would allow it to compete in the GT class. The application was denied because the production numbers fell short of the minimum threshold. As a result, the 250 LM raced as a prototype, and in 1965, in the hands of the North American racing team, a Ferrari 250 LM won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright. It remained, to this day, the last Ferrari to win Le Mans overall. The market value of a verified, unrestored 250 LM with original provenance documentation was, at current comparable sales, somewhere between $15 and $22 million. Chassis number 19 had its own history within the series. It had been driven at Le Mans in 1965 by an American amateur, Raymond Holt of New Haven, Connecticut, running as a private entrant in a year that saw factory teams and well-funded privateers share the same circuit. Holt had not been expected to finish. He finished. Then he had the car shipped home to the United States, registered it privately in New Haven County, had it serviced once at a facility in Middletown, and after that removed it from any form of public record. No sale, no export, no dismantling on record. The car simply ceased to appear in any documentation after 1967. Sebastian had written a full chapter about Chassis 19 in his reference book. He had titled it The Phantom of 65. He had pursued inquiries through 7 countries over the course of 2 decades. He had twice received information that turned out to describe a different car, a different number, a different story. The chapter had remained, in every subsequent edition of the book, the only one that ended without resolution. Liam removed the contents of his folder 1 page at a time and placed them on the table. The first was the original title, New Haven County, Connecticut, dated February of 1966, bearing Raymond Holt's name and a street address in the East Rock neighborhood. The second was a service receipt from a restoration shop in Middletown, dated March of the same year, with handwritten Italian annotations in the margins from the technician who had done the work. The third was a photograph, black and white, glossy, taken with a film camera by someone standing at the edge of a race circuit rather than from a professional position. In the photograph, a man stood beside a racing car still wearing his driving suit, his face marked with the grime of road dust and exhaust that accumulates over 24 hours of competition. He was smiling. Behind him, the car's competition number board was clearly visible, 19. The fourth item was a letter, handwritten on personal stationery and fountain pen. The ink faded to a pale brown, the paper yellowed at the edges. Raymond Holt to his daughter, written in the autumn of 1967. Sebastian read it without being invited to, which Liam permitted because the letter had been placed on a table in a room and permission was not the point. In it, Raymond explained that he had decided not to sell the car, not for any investment reason, not from any expectation of future value, but because there were certain things a man kept not to display, not even precisely to remember, but simply to look at when he needed to confirm to himself that he had once gone the full distance without stopping. Sebastian set the letter down. His hand rested on the table, and it was not entirely steady. Julian Shaw, who had been standing at Sebastian's left shoulder reading in silence, said quietly, "Sebastian, are you certain?" Sebastian looked up. "I wrote a chapter about this car. I have been looking for it for 20 years. He picked up the flashlight and held the beam toward the chassis number for anyone who wished to look. "I am certain." Liam stood at the edge of the table. He was not looking at the documents. He was looking at the car, the way a person looks at something when they are learning what it feels like to see it for one of the last times, when they are trying to do the looking carefully enough that they will be able to keep it. Carenza tugged lightly at the back of his hand. Did Mom know it was special? He looked down at her. She knew since she was a little girl. But Raymond didn't want it to be about showing off. He wanted it to have a purpose, the right one, at the right time. The afternoon session at Harmon Prestige was scheduled from 3 o'clock. 15 lots had been listed in the printed catalog, led by the Aston Martin DB5 and the Jaguar E-Type, with a collection of coach-built European cars making up the remainder. At 2:15, Aaron Cole had made 4 phone calls. By 2:40, the catalog had been amended. By the time the auction room opened its doors, a 16th lot had been added at the end. Ferrari 2, 50 LM, chassis 19, 1963, private collection, single-owner consignment, with authenticated provenance documentation, Sebastian Crane, certifying authority. The room that had held 50 people at the morning preview held considerably more by 3 o'clock. Word had moved through the building, and from the building into the phones of people who had been at lunch or in the parking structure or managing other business on the other side of the city. By the time the room filled, there were 11 faces that no one on the staff had checked in at the front desk. 3 individuals who had apparently driven from Boston within the 2-hour window since the lot was announced, and a pair of buyers' representatives in the back row who had not been present that morning, and whose quiet conversation with each other had the focused quality of people who had already calculated their ceiling and were now debating whether to revise it upward. Sebastian Crane sat in the front row with his book on his knee and his laminated documentation on the empty seat beside him. He had been asked informally whether he would remain present for the lot as an authenticating witness. He had said yes, without negotiating terms, because the terms were not the point. Giselle Harmon presided from the podium at the front of the room with her customary economy of language precise, efficient, neither overselling nor underplaying, conducting the first 15 lots with the authority of someone who is very good at her work and knows it. Whatever had occurred in the assessment room that morning was not visible in how she conducted the afternoon. Liam and Carenza sat in the third to last row. Carenza had the little red model on her knee, both hands resting on it, watching the front of the room without particular expression. She had kept it there, through the administrative hour, through the consignment signing, through the entire interminable legal patience of the paperwork. She had not put it down. The Ferrari lot was announced without fanfare, in the same register as everything that had preceded it, because Giselle understood that a thing does not need to be shouted to be significant, and that sometimes restraint is the most effective amplifier. The opening bid was set at $8 million. Sebastian's figure, grounded in comparable sales for 250 LMs, in unrestored but fully original condition. The number appeared on the board at the front of the room in clean type. Julian Shaw raised his paddle without hesitation. 8 million. A phone bank representative raised her hand. 8.5. Julian. 9. A second phone entered. 9.5. Julian. 10. The first phone dropped at 11.5. The second stayed. 12. 12.5. Julian, without looking up from the catalog open on his lap, which he had stopped reading several lots ago. 13. Julian again. 14. The remaining phone. 14.5. At 15 million, Giselle gave Aaron Cole a signal small, 2 fingers, barely visible from the rows behind. Aaron raised the paddle. 15.5. Julian. 16. Aaron. 16.5. Julian. 17. Aaron. 17.5. Julian. And now he looked up from his catalog and looked at Aaron Cole directly, and past Aaron toward the section of the room where Giselle sat, and his expression shifted, only slightly, to the expression of a man who has realized whom he is bidding against and has decided to continue regardless. 18 million. Aaron. 18.5. Julian. The remaining phone dropped out at 19. 19.5. Julian Shaw, who set his catalog down on the seat beside him as he raised the paddle. 20 million. Aaron raised the paddle. Julian looked toward the back of the room. He looked at Liam Davenport, the man in the worn flannel shirt sitting in the third to last row with his daughter's hand in his. He looked at him with the particular attention of one person who recognizes something in another that most of the room would not notice and cannot be explained in the few seconds available. Then he raised his paddle. 21 million. The room held its breath. Giselle sat perfectly upright in her chair. She looked at the board. She looked at the car on the low platform at the far end of the room, positioned under 3 focused lights. The rust and the faded paint, somehow made more significant by the illumination rather than less, the way certain things require the right light to reveal what they have always been. She looked at Aaron. She gave one nod. 22 million. Julian Shaw set his paddle on the seat beside him and did not lift it again. The gavel came down. The sound of it traveled through the room the way sound travels in a space that has gone very still, clean, and complete, with nothing to absorb it. Carenza heard it and looked at her father. Liam was looking at the car. When the signing was done and the room had begun to empty, Sebastian found Liam in the corridor outside the assessment wing. Carenza had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder. He was carrying her with one arm under her knees, her head against the side of his neck. The little red model was still in her hand. Sebastian did not say anything for a moment. The hallway was quiet and fluorescent, and they stood in it the way 2 people stand when they have been through the same strange afternoon and are still adjusting to the other side of it. "Did you know what you had before today?" Sebastian said. "Yes," Liam said. "Clara showed me everything when we were first married. The documents, the photograph, she'd known since she was a child. And you held it all that time." Clara was still alive. The car was the last real connection she had to Raymond. "I wasn't going to sell it while there was something else to try." He looked at the wall across the corridor. "After she died, it felt like dismantling something she'd left behind on purpose. I couldn't bring myself to it. But now, Carenza needs surgery." He said it without decoration, the way people state the condition that has reordered everything else, when there is nothing to be gained from framing it differently. Her spine. The cost is significant. This was what remained. Sebastian was quiet for a time. He was a man who had spent his professional life studying the histories of objects, what accumulated in them, what they witnessed, what meanings settled into them through decades of handling and care and deliberate preservation. He did not say he was sorry, because sorry was not the right instrument for what had just been said. He simply stood with it, which was the thing that was needed. Then Carenza stirred, shifted, and opened her eyes. She looked at Sebastian with the unhurried assessment of a child waking in a room she doesn't immediately recognize. "You know a lot about the car," she said. "Not quite a question. More than almost anyone," Sebastian told her. She considered this. "Do you know what Raymond looked like when he was happy?" Sebastian looked at her carefully. "I've read the race records. I've studied every photograph taken at the circuit that year." He paused. He looked like a man who had just finished something very difficult and was glad he hadn't stopped before the end. Carenza looked at him for a moment longer. Then she held out her hand, the one without the model, and Sebastian, after a brief pause, reached into his satchel and produced a copy of his book. He placed it in her palm. "Every word I know about that car and that race is in here," he said. "When you're old enough to read it, I'll answer any question it doesn't." She took the book and held it the same way she held the model, as something that belonged to her now and that she intended to keep. There was a memory that Liam did not speak aloud, and that the corridor had no way of knowing about. A night in the garage, 3 years earlier, Clara, 7 months pregnant, standing at the car with her palm flat on the hood. She had spoken without preamble, almost to herself, the way people speak when they are thinking rather than talking. Raymond always said it was built to run, not to be a trophy. When the time comes, let it run. Liam had asked, "When's the time?" She had smiled the kind of smile that contains more than it shows, when it's needed most. He had held that sentence through everything that followed. This morning was when he understood the full measure of it. The lawyers finished at 5:30. The staff had begun clearing the auction room. Most of the clients had gone. The Ferrari sat where it had been positioned on the low platform, now covered in a padded transport blanket, waiting for the crew that would move it to Harmon's climate-controlled holding facility the following morning. Giselle found Liam near the building's main entrance. She was alone. No Aaron Cole, no assistant, no clipboard. For the first time since he had arrived at this building, she approached him the way a person approaches another person, without the frame of a role she was performing. She stood at a reasonable distance and waited until he looked at her. "I'd like to make a secondary offer," she said. The phrasing was careful, professional instinct, running even in this register. Beyond the sale price, the provenance documentation, the title, the photograph, the letter, is properly historical material. It should be housed with the car. I'm prepared to compensate you for it accordingly. Liam looked at her, not unkindly but without softening. "What did you call it this morning?" Giselle said nothing. "You called it scrap metal," Liam said, "in front of my daughter. I had misjudged the—" "You didn't misjudge the car," he said. "You misjudged the person standing next to it." The words were not loud. They carried no heat. That was precisely what made them settle the way they did, not like a blow, but like something placed on a surface with careful intention, where it would remain. Giselle was quiet. He reached into the folder and removed the contents, arranged them on the table in sequence one by one, unhurried, the same way he had done everything in this building from the beginning. "The documentation goes with the car. It's in the consignment agreement. I put it there before I signed. Your legal team has the clause." He set the folder back in the bag. "Not because I need more money, because that letter is Raymond's story, and it should follow the car he wrote it about. It shouldn't end up in a filing cabinet because someone negotiated the paperwork separately." Giselle looked at the bag. She looked at the covered car on the platform. She said nothing. Liam picked up his jacket from the chair beside the entrance and put it on. "You sell cars worth millions of dollars," he said. "But this morning you didn't know which one was worth looking at until Sebastian pointed it out to you." He picked up his bag. "I think that's something worth sitting with, when you have time." Then he walked to where Carenza was sitting on the low bench against the wall, feet dangling, Sebastian's book across her knees. He took her hand. She slid off the bench without being prompted and looked up at him. "Ready?" She looked once around the tall ceilinged room, the marble floor, the lights, the covered car, at the far end, and then looked at him. "Ready." Giselle stood by the entrance and watched them cross the floor and push through the glass door. The space they left was not empty. It had the particular quality that rooms acquire after someone has said something true in them, the kind of truth that continues to occupy the air for some time after the speaker has gone, that a room takes a while to process back into neutral. Sebastian was still in the building when they passed him in the outer corridor. He stood to one side as they went by, and he and Liam exchanged a brief look, the kind that doesn't require language, the kind between people who have understood something in the same room at the same time and know it. Sebastian watched them pass through the main door, stood for a moment in the corridor, then turned back for his satchel and stepped outside into the October evening. He dialed a colleague in Turin, a racing historian he had known for 30 years. When the man answered, Sebastian said, "I found it. Chassis 19. It was in a garage in New Haven. A man named Liam Davenport had it." There was a long pause. Then the colleague said something. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly and nodded. "Yes," he said, 22 million. But that's not the part that's going to stay with me. The parking structure outside the building was nearly empty by the time Liam and Carenza reached the truck. The flatbed trailer sat where he'd left it unhitched, empty now, looking exactly like what it was. He helped Carenza up into the passenger seat. She buckled herself in with the practiced efficiency of a child who has done it thousands of times, and settled back with Sebastian's book on her lap and the little red model in her right hand. Liam walked around to the driver's side and got in. He sat for a moment without starting the engine. Through the windshield and through the parking structure's open face, he could see a slice of the building's rear, the high windows, one light still burning inside, the Harman Prestige nameplate on its bracket above the service entrance. He started the truck. The engine turned over with the particular complaint of engines that have earned the right to complain rough at idle, settling after a moment into its usual uneven rhythm, nothing like the precision machinery that had just sold for $22 million in a room with marble floors. "Dad," Carenza said. She was looking at the model in her hand, tracing the worn nose with her thumb. "Are we sad?" He looked at her. "No, but we don't have the car anymore. Raymond said it was built to run," he told her. "Now it's going to run again under the right lights, in front of the right people. That's what it was for." Carenza thought about this with the particular seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to questions they have decided are important. Would Mom be happy? Liam put the truck in gear and looked out at the narrow strip of evening sky visible above the parking structure. The light gone from gray to a pale, cold blue at the edges, the last of the day going out quietly over the city. "Mom would be happy because you're going to be okay," he said. He pulled out of the space and drove toward the exit. Carenza leaned her head against the window and looked at the little red Ferrari in her hand, the worn nose, the paint rubbed smooth by years of small fingers that had needed something to hold. She didn't put it down. She hadn't put it down all day. The truck rolled out of the structure and into the street. Behind them, through the glass and the climate-controlled air and the padded transport blanket, Chassis 19 rested in the dark of the Harman Prestige holding bay, waiting for the careful hands that would, in the months ahead, return it to what it had always been, a thing built to move, at speed, toward a finish line. Liam drove. Carenza held the model. The city passed around them and fell behind, and after a while there was only the road and the uneven sound of the engine, and the two of them going home.